Hey, what's up guys? Today we're going to be comparing EULA and Albedo. I'm going to be going over the strengths and weaknesses of both of these characters since they are both getting a rerun next patch so that I can help you decide which one to pull for, if any. Now since EULA and Albedo are two very different characters, EULA being a hyper carry and Albedo being a support or a sub DPS, the way I'm going to proceed is by showing the pros and cons of both of these characters, showing when they're stronger and when they're weaker, so that you can then make an informed decision based on what you need, what you want, playstyle, and all that. So the way I'm going to be doing this is by talking about first of all EULA's strengths, then EULA's weaknesses, and then I'll move on to Albedo's strengths, Albedo's weaknesses, talk about the two together and what I recommend. Although as I mentioned, they do serve very different roles, and so how valuable each of these characters is does highly depend on your account and what you need, which is what I'll try to highlight in this video. So with that being said, I just want to get right into it. Alright, so first of all, let's start by talking about EULA. EULA is a hyper carry who has a lot of potential that mainly will come through her powerful normal attacks, her hold E that reduces physical resistance of opponents and deals massive amounts of damage with the hold, and obviously her elemental burst, which has one of the highest scalings in the game. Her burst costs 80 energy, which means she usually needs to be ran with a cryo battery, but it's an ability that deals multiple hits. It'll start by slicing and then it'll have this sword around you that stacks up the more you hit it. Now the reason this is important for me to explain is because a significant portion of her damage comes from her burst. While her normal attacks are quite powerful as well, her burst is a very significant part of her kit, where it's always important that you maximize this and play around it. This is important to understand because if your burst isn't one-shotting or two-shotting enemies, you're going to get a lot less value from EULA. That is why she's a character who is absolutely amazing and top tier at high investment. EULA's strength and potential is one of the ones that depends on investment more than pretty much any other character. This is why some people will see a EULA showcase and be like, okay, she's the best unit in the game, and others will see her at lower investment or a free-to-play EULA or even like an early game EULA that's doing a lot less damage and then feel underwhelmed. I therefore have a more nuanced take on this character, as objectively, at high investment for speedrunning, for hyper carrying, she's one of the strongest if you can get to the late game with her, give her good artifacts, high talent levels, a good weapon, all that. However, at low or moderate investment, this is probably her biggest weakness, so I'm kind of covering a strength and a weakness at the same time. You will perform better at lower investment on some other carries, whereas at higher investment, someone like EULA can outshine a lot of other DPSs in the game and be one of the strongest at, as I said, speedrunning when you can clear in like 1 or 2 bursts. Now, another big strength with EULA is actually regarding her teams. Now, while I'll go into more detail on EULA's teams in my updated EULA guide coming out somewhat soon, you guys need to know that EULA is a character who doesn't need very high priority supports. It's very easy to make a EULA team, and you don't need characters like Bennett, although he can work with her, but you don't need Bennett, you don't need some of the high value Anemo supports, you don't need Stengths, which means you oftentimes have these other high value characters that everyone wants available for your second team. EULA basically just wants a cryo battery. Someone like Diona can work because she's also a healer and a shielder, gives you a lot of particles, especially when you give her a sacrificial or a Favonius bow. And then you also want an electro unit, someone like Fischl or even Raiden, who can apply superconduct and deal a lot of damage. Raiden will deal damage and give you energy when she's attacking, whereas someone like Fischl will deal massive amounts of off-field damage and is also a 4-star character that was even given for free in an event a while ago, to where she is definitely a more accessible character. And so a team like this, right, with a flex slot at the end, is pretty easy to build, and Diona and Fischl are units that synergize very well with EULA without being as high priority as some other units like Bennett, Xingqiu, Kazuha, and all that. As I mentioned, the last character here can be many options. It can be someone like Beto if you want her to just deal a bunch of damage, or it could even be a cryo battery, someone like Rosaria. And obviously, instead of Fischl, you can even run other electro batteries like Raiden, or even honestly the electro main character works as well in some EULA teams, allowing you to run insanely low energy recharge. Because of that, I believe it's a very big strength that EULA has free-to-play friendly teams and like overall just cheap and flexible teams. That's definitely something worth considering. Another strength of EULA, and you know, this isn't for everyone because not everyone pulls for constellations, like I don't personally, but she does have good constellations, even some relatively accessible ones. For example, her first constellation is a pretty big DPS increase, so is her C3 and her C6 as well. So while I'm not someone who typically recommends constellations for 5-star characters because they're very expensive and not really needed, she definitely has some that will spike her damage up, as that is something that I do consider to be an advantage for certain players. Also, and I want to point this out, her DPS increase with constellations is big enough to where a lot of the times if you watch like a EULA showcase versus a C0 one, the DPS difference is absolutely insane because you can stack your burst more with EULA's constellations and just deal way more damage, even with just like the talent levels and all the buffs that you gain. Although obviously this is more niche and these aren't needed for EULA at all, as I personally play her at C0 and I can obviously clear like any piece of content. Now another strength and also weakness at the same time, because I'm very not good at splitting strengths and weaknesses because a lot of them are tied to each other, is regarding EULA's physical damage. Now, while dealing physical damage is a weakness, because some enemies like current floor 12-3, the Ruin Guards, the Ruin Graders, Ruin Hunter, have very, very high physical damage resistance, and it's also harder to buff physical damage. So you kind of, for example, lose out on Verdescent Venerer supports, right? Strong Anemo carries that can reduce the resistance of enemies when they swirl aren't as useful with EULA because this doesn't work with physical. However, EULA has a lot of ways, even just by herself, to reduce physical resistance. This is one of her big strengths as well, as her elemental skill. When you do hold this ability, it will actually, as you can see, decrease the physical resistance and cryo resistance of enemies. This res shred is something that will scale a bit with your level. Even just at this low talent level, it's over 20%, which is very nice. On top of that, you can pair her with an electro support, which is what I recommend, to run superconduct to shred physical resistance even further. Physical carries aren't as universal though, and there is some content that's annoying for physical DPSs, but also for EULA in general. So this is a weakness I want to point out, especially regarding her burst. Some enemies can be wonky, can dodge or randomly iframe your burst sometimes, like the Magukenki dashing, making it miss, or even having some inconsistencies like, let's say your burst doesn't crit, you're usually just going to instantly reset the floor. If your burst, instead of doing like 200k, does, 80k or something if you're on a lot of crit damage. And so that is something to consider. Her burst can sometimes be wonky. I've noticed this from playing her a lot, although it is very satisfying when everything works out. Overall though, and I want to summarize it thusly to not start repeating myself, EULA is a character who can easily hyper carry you through any content, even with very low investment supports, but you do have to invest a ton into EULA, as she is a character whose potential is directly linked with how much investment you put into her, how well she's geared, weapons, constellations, and all that. She's great for speedrunning, but not as strong in the early game, so you do want to be sure to not neglect her if you pull for her, and definitely gear her and max her artifacts, as she depends on these more than the typical carry. And lastly, I do want to point out, she does have very flexible weapons. Literally every single 5-star is very good on her, and also she has very good 4-star options, free-to-play options, like the new Fish Claymore, even Snow-Tombed and Prototype Archaic are good, and just good 4-stars overall, with something like the Battle Pass option being amazing, and even the new Akumaru, and others that I'll cover with an exact weapon ranking in my new EULA guide. Alright, now that we talked about EULA, let's talk about Albedo, and I'm going to give you guys a general rundown and then go into the strengths and weaknesses. I believe Albedo is honestly one of the most flexible characters in the game. While his meta teams right now are mainly teams where you can fully utilize him, like a double Geo comp running Albedo and Zhongli with pretty much anyone, he is pretty much just a good flex slot in any team as a last option. The reason for this is because he deals massive amounts of off-field damage with his skill that scales on his defense. This generates quite a lot of particles and deals good damage, and you don't have to think about it too much. You press it once and it stays there for 30 seconds. I wasn't planning on starting with this, but I do want to talk about Albedo's teams because I feel like this is essential to understanding how good he is for you and whether or not he's worth it. Albedo in general, as I said, can replace a lot of characters you don't have, but isn't really needed in that many teams, where I would typically say if you have Albedo, he can be very good to use in many teams, but he's not really someone you need to pull for. That being said, there are some teams where he's the best option, and that's typically when you pair him with Zhongli. Albedo plus Zhongli together is a pretty solid core that can fit many teams, like this Shao one, running Shao, Jean, Zhongli, Albedo, being a very strong Shao team, and also a similar Hu Tao team, where you're just running, the main two characters, so Xingqiu plus Hu Tao, and then this team will work as well. That being said, both Hu Tao and Shao have other teams they can make if you don't have Albedo, so they aren't by any means dependent on him. And I'd say the only teams that are dependent on Albedo are going to be Geo teams that can fully utilize the Geo particles he gives, the constant Geo damage, and also being an extra Geo character. As we know, Goro is going to give you buffs based on how many Geo characters you have. We don't exactly know their power level yet though of Goro and Ito, but I do suspect Albedo will synergize well with them. Although as of right now, I can say that one of his strengths is being very flexible and also fitting pretty much any team when you pair him with Zhongli. Another thing I wanted to point out is that he does give elemental mastery to your team, which can be nice if you're trying to proc reactions. Do keep in mind that I've heard a lot of people complain that Albedo can sometimes make you miss out on a vaporize, mess up some reactions, and while that is true, especially if you're running like Albedo Zhongli and you let the Zhongli pillar hit as well, it doesn't happen that much, at least from my testing. His skill will have a weak elemental gauge, meaning it doesn't mess up your reactions too much, but if you do want more information about elemental gauges and how this stuff works, I will link a video by Zajeff77 that explains it in more detail in the description. I also wanted to point out that Albedo can have a couple different playstyles and some flexibility regarding like his artifact stats. His skill is very strong to where you're typically going to build him defense, but after that, like his burst is also quite good to where you can either build a hybrid build running some crit rate and defense, or just a pure defense build if you're only using him for his skill, both of these abilities being pretty good, with his skill being the main one. Because of that, artifact wise, you have a lot of options, although for your set, there's actually a new set coming out, so it'd save all your resin for that if you plan on building Albedo, because it's just insane, giving you defense and geo geo damage. And so Albedo is getting a buff in 2.3, which is definitely a strength for him. Not only are new geo characters coming out, but he's also getting a new artifact set that's absolutely amazing, and even a new weapon. Now, while the stats of this weapon aren't confirmed, and I know there's some rumors out there, but basically it's pretty much guaranteed to be an Albedo sword since it's teased for like his rerun and his event and stuff. So there's definitely going to be big Albedo buffs coming soon. And while I recommend you wait for this new weapon, either way, Albedo has an amazing free-to-play option with Harbinger of Dawn, giving a ton of crit rate, crit damage, and just being amazing for him because the low base attack doesn't affect him that much. I do want to point out one thing though, and this can be considered a weakness, is that Albedo does want to be leveled all the way to 90 ideally. I am too lazy to farm flowers right now, but I will 90 him soon, I promise. Albedo is someone who really wants level 90 or as high level as you can because he scales off of defense, and so your base defense really matters. Base attack on characters doesn't matter as much since it's a lot easier to get a lot of attack, but for a character who scales on defense or scales on HP or another stat, leveling them up is very important, to where I do highly suggest leveling Albedo, which can cost a bit more resin, a bit more resources. However, to counteract this weakness, I do want to point out that Albedo is actually very good at all levels of investment, early game, mid game, late game. He can serve his role as an off-field damage dealer, even a geo battery, giving you geo resonance when paired with like Zhongli, where he's not dependent on investment. He's pretty much always a good support, although he is someone who does want to be leveled. Lastly, I wanted to point out that Albedo is someone who is not constellation dependent at all by any means, but he does have some good ones, C1 giving you energy, and especially C2 being the main one I like, making your burst also scale off defense, kind of fixing a bit of the split scaling he has, which is definitely a really good one, so he can increase in potential if you are someone who likes pulling for constellations. Now, with all that being said, I think now is a good time to point a few things out regarding both these characters. Well, I mentioned first of all regarding EULA that she is someone who gets a lot better with investment, you know, a top tier character at like speedrun levels of investment, at high investment, but not as valuable in the earlier mid game. That is something that I wanted to emphasize in this video because it can be more or less impactful depending on where you are in the game or what type of player you are. A lot of people like characters that get a lot better in the late game because they might have good artifacts or pull for constellations or 5-star weapons, whereas for others that's a big drawback, so it is something that I wanted to be clear. For Albedo as well, I want to be clear that he is a character who, as I said, is very flexible, but isn't someone who is needed or meta defining, although I do think he gets better with the future geo characters while still not being a must pull. I've been very clear on my stance multiple times that I believe support characters in general are very valuable. Good supports that are flexible, that can fit many teams, and that have a universal role are a lot easier to fit in a team, whereas DPS characters, I recommend pulling for the ones you like. Like, power level does matter, but also being enjoyable as your main carry is important since there are so many very powerful DPSs. That being said, I don't want to overhype any character. Obviously, Albedo isn't the same level as someone like Kazuha or Bennett or Venti, but he is flexible and fits geo teams very well. With that being said, to recap this video, both characters in my opinion are pretty good. EULA is a character with very big strengths, but also some weaknesses that you have to play around, that you have to know about, especially regarding her burst and being physical and needing investment, but also being very powerful, having very free-to-play friendly teams, strong constellations if you're into those, and being a hyper carry. Albedo, on the other hand, is a flexible support, getting a lot of buffs in the next patch, a new weapon, new artifacts, new teams, but also being very good in those geo teams while also being flexible in the sense that, you know, Albedo Zhongli can be a core support line in a couple different teams. Because of that, the conclusion of this video has to be it depends, because it depends on you. Do you need a hyper carry or do you need a support like Albedo, depending on what teams you're running? Because neither of these characters are for everyone. Albedo is not someone that an account needs, but can be a nice addition depending on who you have and what teams you plan on running. Personally, I enjoy both of these characters. I have a lot of fun with EULA because I'm an endgame player and I just enjoy one-shotting everything. It's very satisfying. And I also find geo teams to be very fun, although they aren't really meta defining, at least as of right now. And so those are my overall thoughts. That was kind of a recap, but I don't want to repeat myself too much. I'll put on screen right now a sort of notepad that I made, kind of writing down general strengths and weaknesses. This might not have covered everything. I went into much more detail in this video than just this notepad. So this is just like a quick TLDR of both of their strengths and weaknesses. And so I wanted to compare both of them in this video, show you the strengths and weaknesses of both in this video. Although do keep in mind that, you know, which one is worth pulling for does depend on many factors, especially with one being a DPS and the other being a support. It's kind of unfair for me to just recommend one and say, you know, this one's better, because they serve very different roles and can be worth it or not worth it depending on who you have and who you need. If you already have two very powerful DPSs, let's say a Shao team and a Shangling team, do you really need a third DPS character? Typically, I would advise against it unless you enjoy, you know, EULA's playstyle more than your existing DPSs if you already have top tier carries. The same thing can be said with Albedo if neither of your teams need him, or if you don't plan on running like a Geo team or Albedo Zhongli, or anything like that. So yeah, with that being said, that's about it. If there's anything I want to add, because there's a lot to cover in this video, it will be in a pinned comment, so be sure to check that. I really hope you guys enjoyed. After this video, I'm actually traveling for a bit because I'm going to Hoya Fest in New York, so maybe I'll see some of you guys there. I do have some videos pre-recorded that I'll be uploading, and I will be streaming over there. So if you want to catch any updates, maybe see me meet up with other content creators or anything like that, be sure to follow me on all my socials, link in the description. And if you enjoyed the video, have any questions or whatever, be sure to leave it in the comments because I will read most of those. So yeah, with that being said, I hope you enjoyed the video. EULA, Albedo, very different units, but both have very strong strengths and also some weaknesses that you have to consider. With that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed, and as always, I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.